Well, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming, who I now can't see with the lights dimmed. This session is about Symfony2 and Drupal 8. My name is Larry Garfield. Online I am Krell. That's my name on Twitter if you feel like making fun of me during the session. I'm a senior architect at Palantir.net. It's a Drupal development shop based in Chicago in the United States. I'm an advisor to the Drupal Association Board of Directors for Drupal 8. I am the Web Services and Context Core Initiative owner. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. I'm the co-author of Drupal 7 module development from Pact Publishing, which is one of the best rated books for learning Drupal development. Mostly I go to conferences, Drupal conferences, and talk about good development practices in architecture and shoot my colleagues with Nerf darts. It's part of Drupal culture. At Palantir, we build sites with Drupal, mostly for institutional not-for-profits. So Barnard College in New York is one of our clients. The Journal of Foreign Affairs, which if you follow international politics at all, this is the gold standard magazine for that. The Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which is one of the largest natural history museums in the world. OpenSource.com is a collaboration between us and Red Hat. Marketplace, are there any Americans in the room here? A few of you, you know, Marketplace, the public radio show, we did their site. That's just kind of our background. But we're not really here to talk about my company. We're here to talk about Drupal. Before I go any further, who here has heard of Drupal before this conference? Okay, who here has used Drupal? Who here has used Drupal and kept using it voluntarily? Okay, who used Drupal and ran screaming? Okay, hopefully I will make those people feel better by the end of today. So Drupal is the world's largest PHP open source content management system. At last report, 1 in 50 websites on the internet run Drupal. It began in 2001. Currently powers everything from your run-of-the-mill blog to some web applications, social networking sites, major e-commerce sites, Examiner.com, which is a top 100 website in the world, major social news site, whitehouse.gov, King of Belgium. Those are sites that are powered by Drupal. So it's a fairly successful project. And I'm a bit biased, but I'm quoting Symfony here to say Drupal is awesome. Believe me, really. Those of you who were jittery before. Our focus is end users. For people who just want to put up a website easily, Drupal is the best game in town. It has an incredibly powerful administrative interface, an immense amount of power exposed just to clicky-click button pushers who can then build very robust, very capable websites and social networking sites fairly easily. If, as I said, Drupal is the top open source PHP CMS. If you go into a company, my company, we often have clients come to us specifically because they want a Drupal site. It is at the size where people don't say they want a website and it happens to be in Drupal, but they want a Drupal site because Drupal is what you use for that level of site, which makes it really easy to sell. Arguably, Drupal sucks for developers. This is not quite true. This is a reputation in some areas, probably around here too, but this is not entirely true. Drupal sucks if what you want is a pure framework. That's fair. Drupal is not a pure framework. Drupal was built first as a content management system, and then evolved framework capabilities under the hood in order to become more flexible and more powerful. And at this point, Drupal has evolved to the point that we sometimes refer to as a framlication, a kind of framework application hybrid, which gives it, in some areas, an awful lot of power, and in other cases, makes developing for it suck. That's a legitimate complaint. Okay. For example, no clean separation of content configuration logic and content. There really are no good solutions for deploying and staging content. Code, sure, you just put it in Git. But for content, it's somewhat yucky. The caching layers are somewhat bizarre at times. Not everyone likes aspect-oriented programming. I know it seems powerful enough to me, but not everyone likes it. It does have a lot of legacy code. As I said, it's 11 years old. And it does have a strong NIH problem. But to be fair, that flexibility that Drupal has comes from that mix and match. And that mix and match is exactly why sometimes content staging is more trouble than you want it to be. When you have a very dynamic, very configurable system, rather than something you hard code to a specific caching configuration, yes, sometimes that cache is going to get interesting. Functional or procedural AOP, aspect-oriented programming, it works, and it's what makes Drupal so powerful, and it's what made Drupal the most flexible system in PHP 4 before we had objects that actually, worked. Who here remembers developing in PHP 4? Yeah, sucked, didn't it? Yeah, this is a much better alternative to the half-assed object orientation in PHP 4. 11 years, you build up a lot of baggage. And let's be fair, the entire PHP world had an NIH problem, not invented here, until the last couple of years. And I'm very happy to see that coming around in the PHP world in general, the work that Symfony is doing, the work that Composer is doing, the Framework Interoperability Group, and the PSR standards. Disclaimer, I am the Drupal representative to the PSR group. But these are legitimate problems with Drupal, and as a Drupal developer, I face these on a regular basis. So let's fix it. Drupal is open to reinventing itself, does so on a regular basis, so we decided we should fix some of these problems. And this brings us to the Web Services and Context Core Initiative. This is a major effort in Drupal 8 that officially started a little over a year ago, shortly after DrupalCon Chicago, but in practice kicked off about 2 years ago when I first started working on this. And the basic idea, or our original mission statement for this effort, was to transform Drupal from the leading CMS in the world to a first-class REST server that happens to have a CMS bundled with it. And to do that, we have to do all this funky, complicated stuff, and I don't even understand it anymore myself. So what are we actually talking about? What do we want to do to make Drupal tomorrow's market leader, not just today's market leader? Well, this is the way that you lay out a page in Drupal 7. And those of you that have been around Symfony for a while probably recognize this. You've got main content area in the page that gets populated by page callback that's based on the URL. And then it gets decorated with additional secondary content, which in Drupal we call blocks. Other systems use a different name, same basic concept. And then, well, there's some general page-level things. And this is great if you're building a blog, and not all that flexible if you want to build very unique layouts. So there are lots of systems that grew up in Drupal, a very robust extension ecosystem that allow different layouts, but they often collided with each other. So we said, okay, this is what we want to be doing instead, and this should, again, look familiar. Request comes in, build up actual request context object with it, do some kind of routing, and then start building the page top-down completely, and just nest blocks inside each other as needed all the way down. And when you do that, then you get the ability to cache blocks independently, do partial page caching, edge side includes, and so forth. There's just one problem, that in order to do that, the page flow in Drupal 7, in terms of how a route gets mapped and the page built, is, I'll be polite and say crufty. I heard a few people laugh. Have you had to deal with Drupal 7's page layout, page routing? Yeah, someone's nodding in pain here. You'll notice there's 3 different possible exits, and this part here is actually all added on via contributed modules. And then we just fork entirely for Ajax commands versus non-Ajax. You really cannot modify this nicely to do that type of page building. So we said, okay, rip the whole thing out and build it properly. And while we're at it, might as well build in REST support. So page layout was actually the first thing we were interested in, not web services, not REST, but just building fancier page layouts. Okay, that requires modernizing the whole system. And that, in a long and roundabout way, is how we end up here. How did we end up here? Well, as the lead for this initiative in Drupal, I said, you know what? We are not the first project to try and do some of this stuff. There should be more collaboration between open source projects. So before we go and write our own request response library, let's see what's out there. And we first looked at Peckle HTTP and found that it was okay, but not great, didn't really work, and trying to port that to PHP so that we could run on systems that didn't have that installed would be way too much work. All right, what else is available? So we just put together a team to look at a couple of different options, and they looked primarily at Symfony2's HTTP Foundation and at Zen Framework. And they came back and recommended Symfony2 for a couple of reasons. First, the libraries were comparable. Neither one was a slam dunk win, but Symfony's was a little bit more flexible, a little bit more powerful. Second, I had a feeling that we would end up doing more work with whatever we ended up adopting than just using one library. And at the time, Zen Framework had a contributor license agreement that Drupal historically has never had, and that was a barrier to Drupal people working upstream that I didn't want to have to deal with. And perhaps the most important reason that we just went with Symfony is while we were discussing this in our public forums, we actually had a few Symfony developers come into our thread and offer advice, offer to help, and actually engage with us. And that, to me, as a Drupal developer, I value the community behind the code more than the code itself. But that, to me, said, this is a community that we can rely on. This is a project that if we start using their code, we'll be able to work with, and we won't just be picking up a library and running away with it, which I didn't want to do. So if you ask, why is Drupal using Symfony2? Well, really, it's all his fault. So we used that and kept on implementing what we had originally planned to do, and ran into challenges because, let's face it, that's a hard problem space. And then I was hanging out in the Symfony dev channel one night last November or so, and I should say one night, my time in Chicago, and ended up talking to another Symfony developer who spent the next 4 hours walking me through how HTTP kernel worked. And I realized, oh yeah, you did that too. Okay, so in for a penny, in for a pound. HTTP kernel is what we wanted to build. It's there, let's just use it. So at that point, really, it's his fault. I think it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, his time, when he finally went to bed, so Stoff, thank you. Are you here? He's here, he's somewhere. So what does this mean? Well, Drupal 7, honestly, is not very well separated. The pieces that make up Drupal are fairly tightly coupled. So we've got the core system, which has various libraries and core modules, and these are not actually all that separated. There's some dependencies in there that made sense 8 years ago when they were first written, but don't anymore. Then somewhere around 16,000 contributed modules built on top of it, at least 2/3 of which are duplicates. Lucas, get used to it. And then this concept of distributions. As Drupal has grown from a CMS into effectively a CMF, the community started building Drupal distributions on top of that, which are prepackaged Drupal sites that you can use as a standalone application. And that runs the gamut from project management tools like OpenAtrium to news websites like Managing News or Open Academy, which is a distribution targeted specifically at universities. And these kind of pre-packaged Drupal sites, or 80% packaged Drupal sites, are increasingly popular. Symfony, much better factored out. You've got the Symfony components, various related libraries like Twig or Ascetic. Then if you're doing full stack framework, then you have the bundles on top of it. Drupal modules and bundles are roughly comparable, give or take. You have larger projects like Symfony CMF that are building on top of that. You've got other projects like Silex that take some of those components and then build a different stack on top of it. And that's more what Drupal is doing. So we're taking a number of the Symfony components, probably some of the same partnered libraries that Symfony Full Stack uses, splitting up our own existing code into proper components, more discrete libraries, better separated core modules, and building the same concept, but with a much more robust underpinning, much more robust platform underneath. At least that's the plan. This is work in progress. So what are we using? At this point, we're using the big ones, but only about, I think it's 8 or so components. Warning, everything else I'm about to say is work in progress. Drupal 8 is in heavy development, so it'll probably change in a week or two. For the better, believe me. So first off, the kernel. We have gone all in as of a week ago, exactly a week ago, right now, give or take a few time zones. Drupal is now powered by HTTP kernel, HTTP foundation, the routing system. We've got Event Dispatcher in there. That is what is powering our main page request system. At the moment, it's still stubbing out a lot of our old functionality, but now that it's in place, we can go through and refactor the rest of that around the kernel model. And one of the advantages of that, then, as and people who have done other Symfony applications will know, ideally, you should be able to embed other Symfony applications within Drupal and vice versa. Whether we'll get that far enough that that actually works, I'm not sure, but we want to. We're trying to steer as close to the existing components as possible, so we're trying to avoid building elaborate structures on top of them such that they don't look like Symfony anymore. And we do want to borrow some of the concepts from the full stack framework as well. This one in particular, the autoloading of controller arguments. We're not going to pull in that bundle entirely, but we're probably going to pull in some of the code for it. So by Drupal 8, a lot of this stuff should look very, very familiar to any Symfony developer. For routing, right now we just have a stub in place that wraps our old routing logic. I'm actually in the process of ripping that out right now and replacing it with a new one because a Drupal site frequently has well over 1,000 routes. Every time I mention this, Fabien has a heart attack, but this is what happens when you have as powerful a UI as Drupal has. So building a new matcher and matcher dumper, all based on the same interfaces as anything else, backed in the database. I'm going to maintain the path matching logic we use now. We are actively working to extend it to do MIME type-based routing as well, so you can split an incoming request on the same URI to application JSON, application HTML, text HTML, all the fun stuff that David was talking about this morning in terms of handling different MIME types differently. That's a work in progress. We tentatively have a standalone library that one of our developers got started. It's not fully developed yet. The idea here is model on Apache's mod negotiation library so that you can still dump routes to Apache htaccess files. This is on GitHub, MIT licensed. We certainly could use help making this work. And again, standalone library, which means any Symfony system or any PHP system at all could use it. At least that's the plan. Frankly, I'm not sure what else to say here because we're trying to not do anything really esoteric in this case. That's the entire point of this exercise. We want to make that core of the system as Symfony-like as possible so that it's more recognizable for you and less work for us, and everyone wins. Dependency injection. Procedural code does that. Drupal's, has a very long procedural history, which means lots of global dependencies that we are slowly working to eliminate. Step one is just by centralizing those. So at Fabien's suggestion, we are using the dependency injection component, not yet for full, to the full extent that Symfony does, but step one is just get stuff in there, especially things that used to be global variables. I know, evil, I agree. But once we've got them attached to the container, then we can refactor them more easily, inject things properly, and so forth. So it's a work in progress. So for the moment, as a transitional state, we do still have a utility function that basically gives us a container singleton. And then it's easy to just grab any of the old information that used to be in globals out of there. If nothing else, this still gets us better testability than we had before. And I do view this as temporary while we transition everything over to a full-on dependency injection model. Event dispatcher. Drupal has an event system. It's called hooks. Those people who've worked with Drupal before, you're all familiar with hooks, right? Yeah. Hooks are very similar to event dispatcher, but instead of having separate objects, they just use function exists for registration, which makes it very easy to use, does allow for very simple procedural aspect-oriented programming, which is incredibly powerful if hard to test. Anyone who's worked in aspect-oriented programming probably understands that. It is faster than event dispatcher. We have benchmarked that, and just the process of firing off hooks is faster than event dispatcher is. And there's no need for a compile step for performance. It's pretty damn fast just out of the box. On the other hand, we're not using classes, so you get no auto-loading, which means you have to have all the code loaded in advance, which is not that bad if you've got APC, but is terrible if you don't, as we've scaled larger. It is a global dispatcher, which means unit testing is quite difficult. And each module, just because of the way they're implemented, can only implement one of each hook. So in Symfony with Event Dispatcher, one bundle can attach to the same events 2, 3, 4, 12 times if it wants to. In Drupal, that's not the case. So for those who have not seen Drupal before, this is basically how it works. You just have a function, name for your module, and the name of the hook. And then you call module invoke all, roughly event dispatcher dispatch, and the hook to call, the values to pass in, and you get back an array of what they passed in. Very simple, very elegant, very fast, very limited beyond what it's originally intended for. My guess for Drupal 8, where we'll end up there, is that Drupal 8 will have both event dispatcher in place and the old hooks system. I don't think we'll be able to replace hooks entirely. We'll be using event dispatcher for stuff closer to the core, so things that touch the kernel. That's all the event dispatcher you're familiar with. But further out in the system, probably still hooks. Again, we just don't have the bandwidth to convert them entirely at this point. Possibly by Drupal 9, we could see that move over entirely. That's still to be determined. There are people pushing to do a full conversion in Drupal 8. Right now, I don't know where that's going to end up. We'll see. Twig. Templating in Drupal 7 is a PHP as template language approach. So if you've got a PHP template file, it's HTML with a bunch of print statements in it. It's backed up by a very powerful, very flexible pre-processing system for controlling the variables that go into the templates. And as of Drupal 7, we now have an array-based rendering system that defers rendering to the last possible moment, which gives you an awful lot of flexibility in terms of controlling the page at a very low level. This is very flexible. We don't need to deal with compiling templates, which makes development easier. It acts as a nice on-ramp so that front-end developers, we have a lot of developers in Drupal who started as front-end developers, as themers, writing templates. and then moved into being module developers. So that's not an uncommon on-ramp. And to be fair, all template languages eventually become Turing-complete. We just kind of cut to the chase and started using PHP because it was already a Turing-complete template language. On the other hand, it's a very opaque system at this point. All that flexibility is hard to wrap your brain around, and that makes it quite unpredictable at times. And Drupal 7 and edge-side includes, for instance, don't necessarily play well together because you can change any part of the page at any time. And it means that front-end developers need to become PHP developers, which most front-end developers don't actually want to do. So this is one of our lead developers, Caroline Negishi, who helped put in this system, and we realized, it took a while, but we realized this is just a very bad idea. So in DrupalCon Denver this past March, the community pretty much collectively said, all right, we start over. Our theme system is too wonky, let's just do over. And started looking at Twig, in part because we know Symfony uses it, and in part because it looked like a viable system. It is substantially more secure by default than what we do now. It is certainly more front-end developer friendly. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone in this room. It opens up the potential for using Twig.js, which is something we'd like to be able to do. And it's one less thing that is Drupal specific. And that's something that I've been pushing for in Drupal very heavily, and a lot of the other lead developers are now pushing this direction as well. The challenges, though, we've been trying to make it work, and the model that Drupal uses right now for controlling templates and rendering is extremely different than the way Twig assumes you're going to work, and making those work together is proving to be a challenge, just as a transitional state so that we don't have to replace the entire code base all at once. And we also need to figure out how to secure the compiled templates, because Drupal, Symfony is built on the assumption that if you're doing serious work on it, you have command line access. Drupal is built on the assumption that we support people who do not have command line access. This makes generating PHP code somewhat more of a challenge to do securely. So we're still working on both of these. We'd like to be able to switch to Twig, but we could use a hand making this work. So if you're a Twig expert, please talk to me. We could use your help. We're also looking at YAML, and actually we just started using that recently, like 2 weeks ago, I think, for our new configuration system. We are talking about using Composer for pulling in the Symfony components, potentially for Drupal modules. That's still under discussion. I'm hoping that happens, but we'll see. Symfony CMF's chain router. Who's worked with that so far? Few people? So we talked to the Symfony CMF people, and they broke the chain router library itself out of the bundle so that we could use it, so that we could build that into our routing system as well. So thank you, guys. So that should be going in within the next month or two, I think. We've talked about other non-Symfony libraries as well. So, from my understanding is most Symfony projects that need to do heavy work with Atom use the Zenfeed library. So we're looking at the same library if we're going to do Atom out of the box. And potentially others. This is not a final list of what Symfony components we're using. It probably will grow by the time we ship. That's all wonderful, but to be fair, if you do a Google search for Symfony newbie, you get this picture from our meeting in Boston where we decided officially Symfony is it. So this is about a dozen Symfony newbies and one guy who I don't think is a Symfony newbie. Yeah. And you wouldn't call yourself a newbie, would you? But to be fair, and here's where kind of the point of this talk comes in, I think. And this isn't a dozen Symfony newbies trying to use Drupal, or trying to use Symfony. It's 3,000. This is a picture from DrupalCon Denver this past March, which is our biannual conference. Over 3,000 people just at the conference. Drupal.org has over 500,000 registered users. As I said, we power 1 out of every 50 websites. This is an enormous influx of people who now want to learn Symfony. who are now going to need help getting better at Symfony and leveraging the components well. And part of why I'm here is to ask for your help, because this is a huge undertaking. I think it's going to be an amazingly good undertaking for Drupal and for Symfony, but we're going to need assistance with it to make sure that we do it right and that Drupal represents Symfony well. If any of this sounds interesting to you, and if you want to help out with making Drupal a better Symfony application, if you want to talk about stuff with the kernel or web services, the routing system, talk to me. If you want to help with the page layout system, or even just advise on how we can build that properly, talk to Chris Vanderwater. Eclipse GC is his name online. Dependency injection, Rob Loesch is leading that charge. If you want to help with Twig and show us how to not do something stupid with it, talk to Jen Lampton. And barely fits here. Our new configuration system, which is now using YAML. Greg Dunlap is leading that charge. His name's Hayrocker online. We have our own issue queue. We are not on GitHub, but we do use Git. So look at Drupal.org for that. If you're an IRC, Drupal-contribute is our main developer channel. The stuff I'm working on specifically is in the Drupal/WSCCI Whiskey channel. We don't actually drink in there, but that's just the name of the channel. And I'm now hanging out in Symfony Dev on a regular basis, and I know several other Drupalers are as well, so we're going to be around. And I'm asking you to please be nice as we work through these changes. And we are trying to be good open source citizens about it. So one challenge, Symfony is MIT licensed, Drupal is GPL licensed. Okay, that means we can't take Drupal code and throw it upstream. But that doesn't mean we can't work on Symfony directly, and we are starting to do so. So you may have seen pull requests coming from Drupalers. You're going to see more of them. For instance, Symfony's Flash message system in the HTTP Foundation. Just too simple for us to use, frankly. We had our own equivalent, Drupal set message, which had a lot more flexibility. But we wanted to be able to throw out ours and just use Symfony. So, less code in the world is a good thing. So we helped design a new API for Flash messages that Thrak from Zukula then implemented. So that is now in Symfony based on the kind of stuff that we were doing in Drupal. And we now have an open issue to drop our Flash message system and our session handling in favor of Symfony's entirely. File streaming. We've got streamed responses in Symfony 2.1. It'd be really nice if those would just let you pass in a file and take care of the streaming for you in a performed fashion. And this is something that belongs to an HTTP Foundation directly, I think. Several other people agree. So we were talking about that in Drupal and said, this really belongs upstream in Symfony. Let's go work on it there. So we have a couple of Drupalers now working on that issue. It didn't start with us, but we are engaged in that, and hopefully we'll be able to put together a pull request there that provides that kind of functionality. And again, the goal, make less code in the world. A couple of others, just some odds and ends pull requests that we filed. This one is still open, so there's some encoding weirdness with JSON in the JSON response object right now. What's that? He just fixed it, thank you. I like this relationship. I actually just found this one yesterday. I didn't even know about this issue until yesterday for allowing the URL matcher to match on a full request object rather than just a partial request in request context. Useful in some cases, not in others, would be necessary for doing MIME-based, accept header-based routing. So we're trying to work out how that could work in Symfony and expect to see more of these as time goes on. So this is an influx of developers into Symfony as well, and I have high hopes for that. Anyone else excited? Okay. So this is a Drupal tradition. We're a very affectionate community, and kind of my hope is that Drupal and Symfony working together will be able to build a stronger framework in Symfony and a stronger CMF in Drupal. And insert common open source love statements here, but this is a huge opportunity for Symfony, for Drupal, and the PHP world in general, I think, to really bring together two large, strong communities and build something awesome with it. And so I'd like to invite you to join us at our conference in Munich, August 20th through 24th. We're expecting somewhere around 2,000 people. Tickets are on sale now. We already have our session list online. It is a mostly Drupal conference, but we do have at least one Symfony session. We have Henry Burgess is speaking as well. Pierre Joy from Microsoft is talking about developing for PHP itself. So we are branching out beyond just Drupal at our conferences as well. Bring your project managers, bring your designers. It's not just a code conference. There are companies that bring their entire staff to it because it is a full-on web development conference. So I hope to see some of you there. And